Okay, so are you ready to dive into Chilean politics?
Always. Especially when it involves a figure as polarizing as Gabriel Boric.
Yeah, I got to say, the stuff you sent me on him, wow. Talk about a mixed bag.
Well, that's kind of the point of this whole grifter gifted thing, right? Trying
Hmm.
to sort through all the noise and figure out if someone's truly changing the world or just playing the game.
Right, right. So Boric, Chile's youngest president ever. Some hail him as a revolutionary hero. Others say he's all style, no substance.
Yeah, I think what fascinates people about Boric is he really taps into this global desire for authenticity and leadership.
Yeah, totally. Everyone's craving leaders who feel real, not just like, polished robots.
Exactly. But that desire for realness can make it tough to distinguish genuine passion from, well, a really good performance.
True. And Boric's story is full of those moments where you're like, wait, is this guy for real?
Right. I mean, start with his background. Born in '86, way down south in Chile, Punta Arenas, Croatian Chilean family, goes off to study law.
Pretty traditional path, you'd think.
Yeah. Right. You'd think. But then the 2010s hit, those massive student protests erupt over education costs and inequality. And Bork, he's right there in the thick of it.
Not just like holding a sign in the back either. He was a leader in that movement, right? Organizing, negotiating, really pushing for change.
Yeah, and it's there we start to see his political ideology forming, this deep belief that Chile's economic model, the one inherited from the Pinochet dictatorship, just wasn't working for most people.
And get this, he dropped out of law school to focus on the movement full time.
Whoa. I mean, how many people would do that? Seriously. It definitely shows a certain level of conviction.
It does, it does. And he didn't fade away when the protests ended either. He helped found the autonomous movement, a left-wing party aimed at shaking things up. This wasn't a guy content with just shouting slogans. He wanted to build something.
Yeah, he wanted real lasting change. And he was good at getting people on board. I mean, in 2013, he gets elected to the Chamber of Deputies.
That's one of the houses in Chile's Congress, right?
Exactly. And he becomes one of the youngest lawmakers in Chilean history. Talk about translating activism into actual political power.
And you got to have some serious charisma to pull that off. He clearly connected with voters, especially younger Chileans who were fed up with the status quo.
Totally. They were hungry for a different kind of politics. And then, boom, 2019, Chile explodes in protests. Started with a subway fare hike, but quickly morphed into something much bigger.
A whole rejection of inequality, a demand for a new constitution. And who's right there helping to negotiate that agreement for a new constitution?
Boric. He was seen as this bridge between the more radical protesters and the established political parties. It's like threading a needle, finding compromise without abandoning his core principles. That's a pattern you see throughout his career.
And it all builds to that crazy victory in 2021. He becomes president at just 35 years old,
Yeah.
youngest in Chilean history. Symbol of hurt for some, but also a target of fear for others. I mean, that's a huge shift for Chile.
Totally, a real shockwave. You have this tattooed, casually dressed millennial promising to basically dismantle the country's entire system. It was a rupture, a clear signal that Chile was entering a new era.
So we have this charismatic leader, compelling backstory, and a mandate for change. But the question is, does he walk the walk? Let's get into his domestic policies, see what he actually did.
Okay, here's where things get interesting. Because Bork's presidency has been this collision of big ideals and the nitty-gritty of actually governing. He came out swinging. Ambitious reforms, increased taxes on the wealthy, universal health care, stronger environmental protections, the whole nine yards. A bold vision for a more equitable Chile, for sure.
Didn't shy away from controversy either. He openly criticized human rights abuses in Latin America, even calling out Maduro's government in Venezuela.
Oh, yeah. That ruffled some feathers on the left. They saw it as siding with the U.S., a betrayal of regional solidarity.
So, genuine commitment to democracy or a strategic move. What do you think?
Tough to say. But that willingness to criticize authoritarian regimes, even those ideologically aligned with him, is interesting. It suggests he might be putting human rights above political convenience, but it definitely made him some enemies.
And then there's his stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, another layer of complexity. He condemned the invasion, which alienated some on the left who blamed NATO expansion, but others praised him for defending international law and sovereignty. It's like he's trying to walk this tightrope.
Exactly. He's charting an independent course for Chile, promoting democratic values, but also navigating this messy, multipolar world. It's a balancing act, that's for sure.
And let's not forget the domestic challenges he inherited. The economy was struggling with inflation, inequality was deeply entrenched, and the political system was still haunted by Pinochet's legacy. It's a lot to handle, even for a seasoned politician.
Absolutely. And those challenges really expose some of the, well, limitations of Boric's leadership style. Some criticized him for being too idealistic, lacking the pragmatism needed for tough decisions, and the rejection of the proposed constitution in 2022. Oof, that was a blow.
Yet it seemed like he overestimated his ability to unite the country behind his vision.
Yeah.
So is he starting to buckle under the pressure?
hmm
Is it all style, no substance after all?
Well, let's explore that in part two, shall we?
Definitely. I'm ready to keep digging.
It's not so much about buckling, I think, as it is about that inevitable clash between idealism and the reality of governing. Take his economic policies, for example. He campaigned hard on tackling inequality, and, he did deliver on some of those promises.
He increased the minimum wage, right?
hmm
I remember that being a big win for labor unions, but also causing some controversy about inflation. It's like every decision has these ripple effects.
Yeah, totally. It really highlights the complexities Boric was dealing with. Boosting the minimum wage obviously helps people struggling to make ends meet, but it can also impact businesses, potentially lead to price increases that hurt everyone. It's that constant balancing act.
He also expanded access to health care, which was another one of his big campaign promises.
hmm
But I imagine overhauling an entire healthcare system is a massive undertaking.
Did he manage to make any real progress there? He made some pretty significant progress, actually. His government rolled out reforms aimed at cutting down wait times and improving the quality of care in the public healthcare system. And you know what else he did? He increased funding for mental health services, which is really interesting given his own openness about his struggles with OCD.
Yeah, that's something that's always stood out to me about Boric, how open he is about his mental health. I mean, you don't see that every day from a world leader, especially in a region where mental health issues are often stigmatized. Do you think that authenticity resonates with people, or do you think it could be seen as a weakness?
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it challenges those traditional views of masculinity and leadership. It makes him relatable, especially to younger generations who are much more open about mental health. But then on the other hand, some might see it as a vulnerability and question whether he's emotionally equipped for the pressures of leading a country.
It's like he's redefining what a president should be. Young, tattooed, open about his struggles, not afraid to shake things up. It's a far cry from the image of, the stoic, silver-haired statesman.
Exactly. He's part of this generational shift, a break from that old mold. And that can be both exciting and unsettling, right? Some see him as a breath of fresh air, a sign of progress. Others see him as this radical, a threat to the established order.
And it's interesting how his personal style seems to amplify both the admiration and the criticism. It's like his tattoos and his casual clothes become symbols of his political ideology, whether he means them to be or not.
For sure. It becomes this projection screen for people's hopes and fears. To his supporters, it's a sign he's one of them, that he gets their struggles. But for his detractors, it's proof he's not serious, not fit to be president.
Okay, let's circle back to his policies. We talked about the economy, his human rights stance. What about his environmental policies? He made some pretty big promises in that area.
Yeah, Chile is really vulnerable to climate change with water scarcity, rising sea levels, and the effects of mining and deforestation. Boric has really positioned himself as a leader on climate change, pushing for ambitious emissions reductions, promoting renewable energy, advocating for a just transition to a green economy.
But he also got a lot of heat for approving that controversial mining project, right? I remember a ton of backlash from environmental groups accusing him of selling out to corporate interests.
Yeah, that Dominga mine project was definitely a flashpoint in his presidency. It's this huge iron and copper mine that got approved despite serious concerns about its impact on this fragile marine ecosystem. That decision really alienated some of his most loyal supporters who felt like he was betraying his environmental commitments.
So which is it, climate warrior or hypocrite? How do you reconcile that grand rhetoric with what he's actually doing?
It goes back to that tension between idealism and pragmatism we talked about earlier. Being in charge often means making really tough choices, weighing different interests, navigating tricky political landscapes. In the case of the Dominga mine, Boric argued that the project would create jobs and boost the economy, benefits that outweighed the environmental risks in his view.
But his critics say that's just a convenient excuse.
Yeah.
That he's choosing short-term economic gains over the long-term health of the planet. That classic sustainable development dilemma. How do you balance economic growth with environmental protection?
Right. It's a challenge that leaders all over the world are grappling with. But in Boric's case, this decision fueled the perception that he's all talk and no action, that he'll compromise his principles when it's politically convenient.
And speaking of compromises, Let's talk about the constitutional reform process.
Yeah.
That was a huge deal for Boric, a chance to create a more just and equitable society. But it didn't exactly go to plan, did it?
No, it didn't. The proposed constitution was rejected in a referendum. A big setback for Boric for sure. It suggests he may have misjudged his ability to bring the country together behind this vision.
That proposed constitution was pretty radical, right? I mean, it included things like enshrining the right to abortion, recognizing indigenous rights, strengthening environmental protections.
Hmm.
It was bold, but maybe a little too bold for some Chileans.
It was definitely ambitious. And while it had a lot of support, especially from younger voters and those on the left, it also sparked significant opposition from more conservative groups who saw it as a threat to traditional values and the economy.
So was it a case of Chileans just not being ready for such drastic change? Or was it more about how the whole process was handled, maybe some missteps by Boric?
It was probably a mix of things, to be honest. There was this really well-organized campaign against the Constitution, a lot of misinformation and fear-mongering going around. But there were also some genuine concerns about the proposed changes, especially among people who worried about economic instability or individual freedoms being undermined.
It's a good reminder that even in a democracy, progress can be slow and messy. Change takes time, and even the best leaders can make mistakes.
Exactly. And for Boric, this was a tough lesson in the limits of his power. It raised questions about his political judgment, his ability to read the situation and build consensus.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Bork's actual achievements. We've discussed his big ideas, the obstacles he's faced, but did he actually make any progress on his key issues?
Well, let's start with the economy. It was a challenging time globally, with inflation hitting Chile hard. But even with those challenges, he managed to get tax reform past increasing taxes on the wealthiest Chileans. That was a big win in his fight to reduce inequality. But of course, it also sparked debate about whether it would discourage investment and hurt economic growth.
Ah, yes. Back to that balancing act. Trying to create a fairer system but not crash the economy while doing it.
Exactly. And, his efforts to strengthen Chile's social safety net are worth noting, too. He expanded childcare access, increased pensions, implemented programs to support small businesses. Those kinds of things might not make the headlines, but they have a real impact on people's lives.
It's true. It's the stuff that affects people every day that really matters. Can they afford to live?
Yeah.
Can their kids get a good education? Do they feel safe? These are things that determine whether a government is actually working.
Absolutely. And Boric seems to get that. What about his environmental record? We talked about the Dominga mine controversy, but I'm sure there are other areas where he's had a more positive impact.
Right. Besides the mine controversy.
Well, he's made some progress on renewable energy, investing in public transportation, protecting forests. He's also trying to tackle water scarcity, which is a huge problem in Chile. These might not satisfy everyone, but they show a commitment to addressing the climate crisis.
And we can't forget about his social reforms either. Legalizing same-sex marriage was a big deal. A major step forward for LGBTQ plus rights in Chile and really across Latin America. That was a bold move, especially considering how much pushback there was from conservative groups.
It was, and it shows he's willing to challenge traditional norms and fight for those who are marginalized. He also expanded access to abortion, which is another really divisive issue in Chile. That aren't easy wins, but he's been willing to stand up for what he believes in, even if it means taking political risks.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the question still hangs in the air. Grifter or gifted? Is Boric the revolutionary hero his supporters believe him to be? Is he just another politician? Or is it somewhere in between?
It's rarely that black and white with leaders like Boric. He's young, ambitious, and wants to make a difference. He's capable of inspiring people and of making compromises. Whether he leans more grifter or gifted really depends on your perspective and what you value.
Yeah, if you're looking for a perfect revolutionary who never compromises, you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you see him as a leader trying to find that balance between idealism and the messy reality of politics, someone who learns and adapts well, then maybe you can appreciate the complexity of his journey.
He's made mistakes, sure, but he's also had some big wins. Only time will tell how his presidency will ultimately be judged. What we can say for certain is that Boric has shaken up Chilean politics, challenged the status quo, and made people think hard about the kind of society they want to live in.
He's a player on the world stage now, not just in Chile. And it's been fascinating watching his story unfold so far. I have a feeling the most interesting chapters are still to come.
That's a great point to leave our listeners with. Whether you think he's a grifter or gifted, there's no doubt that Gabriel Boric is a force to be reckoned with, and his influence on Chile and beyond is far from over.